Hey guys, welcome back to another video, and today we are going over the World Cup qualifiers from the September window. Anyways, we start with Group A, which has Germany, Slovakia, Northern Ireland, and Luxembourg. Germany have 4 World Cup titles to their name, coming in 1954, 1974, 1990, and as we all know, in 2014. However, in the last 2 appearances, they crashed out in the group. However, they are back on the rise after their recent Euro run, where they barely lost in the quarterfinals thanks to that controversial decision. So there is hope for Germany in 2020-26. As an independent nation, Slovakia only have 1 appearance in the World Cup, coming in 2010, where they beat Italy to qualify for the round of 16. They haven't been back since, which isn't all that surprising considering they were 3rd last run, which isn't all that bad until you realize they were 8 points away from Russia, tied with Slovenia. They did beat Belgium in the most recent Euros and made it to the round of 16, and also considering their main opponents for the playoff spot is Northern Ireland, who haven't been at the World Cup since 1986. I'd say they have a really good chance. Speaking of Northern Ireland, their best result in the tournament, however, is their first appearance in 1958, where they advanced to the quarterfinals over Czechoslovakia and Argentina, but got absolutely touched by France. In their most recent qualifying campaign, they finished 3rd, but really were not all that good and barely finished 1 point ahead of Bulgaria, who literally lost to Lithuania. Northern Ireland also finished 5th in their most recent Euro qualifying group, behind the likes of Kazakhstan, Finland, Slovenia, and Denmark. You know it's bad for Northern Ireland when even Luxembourg has a better chance than you. They've been trying to qualify since 1934 and have failed every single time. However, the best run was actually most recently in 2020-22, where they finished 4th, tied with Ireland, and in the Euro 2024 qualifiers, they made it to the playoffs in 3rd ahead of the likes of Bosnia and Herzegovina and Iceland, where they narrowly lost to debutants Georgia. The next group, we could see any of these 4 teams qualify, to be honest. Switzerland, Sweden, Slovenia, and Kosovo. Switzerland's best run in the World Cup is in 1934, 1938, and in 1954, where they reached the quarterfinals all 3 times, but they haven't been able to break the round of 16 curse ever since, especially after getting decimated by Portugal in 2020-22. Sweden's best performance is when they hosted the tournament in 1958 and finished runners-up, losing to Brazil in the final. However, in recent times, they haven't had the best performances and didn't even qualify for the most recent World Cup, where they lost to Poland in the playoff, and the most recent Euros, where they couldn't even make it to the playoff. In Slovenia's 2 only appearances in the World Cup, they haven't made it past the group stages, but despite finishing 4th last qualifying campaign, tied with Slovakia, they still have potential to qualify. As in their first Euro championship since 2000, they advanced to the round of 16 and barely lost to Portugal on pens. Kosovo's first appearance in World Cup qualifying was in 2018, so it's no surprise they haven't qualified for any World Cup, but they have made decent progress in the last years. And despite finishing last, made it to the playoffs in Euro 2020, and just recently promoted to League B in the Nations League. So there is promise for this young nation. Group C, we have Denmark, Greece, Scotland, and Belarus. Denmark's best appearance in the World Cup was in 1998, where they lost to eventual finalists Brazil. Their most recent run was far from those heights, as they finished bottom in a group with France, Australia, and Tunisia. And it's not looking good after their underwhelming performance in Euro 2020-24. Greece have only 3 measly appearances in the World Cup, with their best performance coming in 2014, where they reached the round of 16. They haven't been back since then, but they have been improving as of recent. First to 3rd place finish in 2020-22 qualifying, then they barely missed out on the Euros to Georgia in the playoffs on penalties, and most recently their impressive Nations League run, where they promoted to League A and even beat England on the way, so the future is looking bright. Isn't that bright for Scotland, however, who haven't qualified since 1998. And in all their 8 World Cup appearances, they haven't made it past the group stages once. In fact, they haven't even made it out of the group stages in any Euro performance for that matter. Last World Cup qualifying run, they advanced to the playoffs, however, only to get absolutely fisted by a war-torn Ukraine. The future isn't looking too bright after they got relegated from League A, but maybe McTominay can cook something up and save the Scots from humiliation. Belarus have never qualified for the World Cup, and their best attempt was actually in 2002, and they finished 3rd, just 2 points behind the playoff. But it doesn't look like they will qualify this year after finishing last behind Estonia in 2020-22. In Group D, we have finalists France, Ukraine, Iceland, and Azerbaijan. France have 2 World Cup titles to their name in 1998 and 2018, and almost obtained a 3rd in the big 2020-22 after reaching the final, narrowly losing on penalties, as we all know. And they will most likely qualify for this group, let's be real. In the same group as France for the 2nd campaign in a row, Ukraine only have 1 World Cup appearance where they actually made it to the quarterfinals in 2006 after beating the Swiss on penalties, but lost to eventual winners Italy. They almost made another appearance in 2020-22, but Gareth Bale turned on God mode. Hopefully they do qualify this time. Iceland, like Ukraine, only have one appearance on the world's biggest stage, but unlike the Ukrainians, they didn't even advance past the group stage after having high hopes after their impressive Euro 2016 run and their draw to Argentinians early on in that tournament. They have gone completely backwards ever since, however, due to multiple allegations destroying most of Icelandic players' careers, and they flamed out of 2022 qualified in 5th. Azerbaijan have never qualified for the World Cup. Their best performance comes in 2014 where they finished 4th ahead of the likes of Northern Ireland and Luxembourg, but most recently in 2020-22 they couldn't even beat Luxembourg once. But at least they got a point away in Ireland. Next is arguably the group of death, Group E, with Spain, Turkey, Georgia, and Bulgaria. Spain, the most recent Euro winners and future joint World Cup hosts in 2030, will most likely qualify ahead of Dark Horse FC, Maradona and Hachipuri FC, and underwhelmingly beyond Comparison FC. They have won the World Cup one time back in 2010 thanks to Iniesta scoring this iconic goal. They haven't made it past the round of 16 ever since. 2014 we had the famous loss against the Netherlands, plus their loss to Chile. In 2018 they lost to Russia on penalties, and in 2022 Tiki-Taka got more exposed than Lana Rhodes, and they lost to Japan and Morocco on pens. However, Luis de la Fuente has revolutionized Spain, and they now have sky-high potential and are favorites to go on and win the World Cup in 2020-26. Turkey only have 2 World Cup appearances, but in the second one they went on a massive underdog run and actually finished 3rd place ahead of the fraud South Korea. They haven't been back since then, and in 2020-22 they had the misfortune of being drawn into the death path where they lost to Portugal after barely escaping Norway in the group phase. Georgia have never qualified but have made steps in the right direction as of recent, qualified for their first ever Euros and progressing to the round of 16 after beating Portugal and promoting to League B, all happening in the past 3 years. The best performance goes all the way back to 2002 where they finished 3rd ahead of Hungary. In 2020-22 they didn't do the best, finishing 4th, but that was just at the very beginning of their golden generation, where they beat Sweden and held the Greeks to a draw. But they will hope to avoid a repeat of Euro 2020-24 qualifying again with Spain. Bulgaria's best performance out of all their 7 appearances is famously in 1994 where they finished 4th. And on the way they beat the likes of Greece, Argentina, Mexico, and Germany. However, nowadays they're lucky enough to beat Gibraltar. Last campaign they finished 4th and somehow lost to Lithuania, so it ain't looking too good after finishing last in their Euro group. And finally, the last group, Group F, we have Ronaldo's Portugal, Hungary, Republic of Ireland, and Armenia. Portugal, also the future joint host of the World Cup and the most recent Nations League winners, have surprisingly only 8 appearances in the World Cup, and in the first one they finished 3rd in the Eusebio era. But modern day in the Ronaldo era, the best finish is 4th in 2006. They only managed to make it to the quarterfinals in 2020-22 where they heartbreakingly lost to Morocco. Hungary are arguably one of the best teams to never win the World Cup, making it to 2 finals and losing both in 1938 and 1954. But they haven't been back since 1986 after crashing out the groups, and no surprise considering they lost to Andorra in 2018 qualifying and finished 4th behind Albania in 2020-22. They had a slight rise before and had an impressive Euro 2020 and promoted to League A and did pretty good, finishing 2nd ahead of Germany and Italy. However, any progress they made has been diminished after crashing out of the groups in Euro 2020-24 and getting relegated down to League B in the most recent Nations League. Ireland only have 3 World Cup appearances, but in 1990 they did make it to the quarterfinals. The world hasn't seen the home of the Leprechaun, however, since 2002 where they made it to the round of 16, and it doesn't help that they lost to Luxembourg in 2020-22 and finished barely ahead of them on goal difference. They have a slight golden generation emerging that has so far finished 4th in the Euro qualifying group, only beating Gibraltar and barely surviving relegation to League C against Bulgaria. So it isn't looking too bright, but with them being drawn into this favorable group, there is hope. However, there is no hope for Armenia, with Mkhitaryan retired from the national team and the recent performances in qualified and the Nations League. They have never qualified for the World Cup as well, and their best run comes in 1998 and most recently in 2020-22 with 2 4th place finishes, and in 2020-22 they were actually top at some point, but soon crumbled and even drew Liechtenstein 1-1.